In this video I'm going to be replacing the rear brake shoes, the rear brake drums and the wheel cylinders on my 2008 Smart Fortwo. Hello and a very warm welcome to another video from Auto Night. Now if you saw my earlier video where I carried out a brake inspection on my Smart Fortwo 451, you may remember that I identified that it needed a set of brake shoes at some point soon as the linings had worn quite thin. I'd had some problems getting hold of a set of brake shoes in the sense that the ones that arrived had some damage so I couldn't fit them, but I'm pleased to say I have found an alternative supplier and I now have a set of shoes ready to fit today. So let's crack on with the job. So here we have the parts for today's job. We've got the brake drums, Febi Bilstein, brake shoes from Apec, Napa brake fluid, DOT4, fully synthetic, and some Pagid wheel cylinders, so a whole bunch of different brands here. So the wheel is off, vehicle is supported on an axle stand on this side, and of course I have my trusty Screwfix prayer mat to protect my knees. Now because the handbrake has to be off for a job like this, I have chocked the opposite rear wheel. So we remove this little screw with a T30, Torx 30, and take off the drum. Using a screwdriver I lever the brake shoes out at the bottom. And using this snap-on tool, we just push and twist, which removes the pins, springs and cups. And the same on the other side. This is a great tool, it saves messing about with pliers. Using a pair of long nose pliers, I remove the lower spring. Remember which way it goes and what hole it comes out of. I also remove the upper spring. We can now remove the left brake shoe and the right brake shoe. At this point we need to disconnect this handbrake cable using some side cutters. Now don't cut through the cable whatever you do, but what you can do is pull back the spring and then release it and it's off. There are many ways to change brake shoes. There are so many different sequences that you can do this in, but we all just find our own way when we do this. I like to give everything a good clean up with brake cleaner. Now depending on how you decide to remove a rear wheel cylinder, you can either make it very easy on yourself or you can make it more fiddly. I find it easier on these to get the bleed nipple out the way first. You will want something underneath because it will start to drip. That gives you really good access to the union for the hydraulic line. I use one of these snap-on spanners, which reduces your chances of rounding it off. Make sure it's positioned properly. And undo this, loosen this first while the wheel cylinder is in a good firm mounted position. And once that's loosened, we can then tackle the two 10mm mounting bolts for the wheel cylinder itself. If this pipe here is ever corroded, don't panic too much because you can get this as a section on its own. Just this rear section on each side. I have changed these before on these cars. it's usually the first bit to go scruffy or scabby from corrosion. So now we can undo these two 10mm bolts that mount the wheel cylinder onto the car. The wheel cylinder is now loosened, and you can very easily remove it. And that's the union in there. So here is the new wheel cylinder. Using an 8mm spanner, remove the bleed nipple so we can have access to the union, and remove this little protective cap here. The key to starting the union thread in the wheel cylinder is to do that before you bolt the wheel cylinder solid. That way you've got movement on the wheel cylinder and you've got movement on the pipe, and you can start the thread off. If you bolt the wheel cylinder in place first, it's very difficult to ever get the thread started. A little tip there, I learned that years ago, and it makes such a difference. And that's the thread started straight away, so do it up a reasonable amount but not fully, so there's still movement. Now we can return these little bolts which hold the wheel cylinder in place. These 10mm bolts can now be retightened. They're only small bolts, don't need to murder them up, just tighten them firmly. And now we can fully tighten the union. Refit the bleed screw. We'll be going back to that to bleed the system when everything's back in place, and just nip that up. And that's a wheel cylinder fitted. It needn't be difficult. Now here we can see the difference between the old and the new, and the difference in the amount of material on the shoe there. So you can see they need doing. It's now a case of swapping over these components carefully to the new set of shoes. The easiest way to release this spring from here is to grab this adjuster and release it. And likewise with this little adjuster. This spring is quite weak. Just bear in mind how it's fitted around this piece of the adjuster here and how it slots in there. And that just removes across that distance there. So when this is fitted together, this little sprung-loaded tab here presses down on this wheel and gradually, click by click, turns it, and then this becomes elongated, therefore reducing the distance between the lining and the brake drum as the linings wear. Now these auto adjusters on these cars, unlike many on other cars, do actually work, so it really is important to give this thread here a good clean up, get a little bit of copper slip on it so that it can do its thing when we put this back together. And we're going to adjust it down to its minimum setting, and then once the new shoes are fitted it can work its way out, and there is a process for doing that once it's done, once it's back together. Now I'm just going to apply some copper slip to this thread and work this in and out a few times to make sure it's working okay. And that's really smooth, which will help it to work correctly. And we can now fit this to the new brake shoe. And the remaining half of the adjuster can now be fitted. Just takes a little bit of force to pull that back into position, and it should be resting just above that little nipple there. So here is the new assembly. This is refitted correctly. This is refitted correctly. The two halves of the adjuster, effectively, they do come together. That threaded piece does go inside here. More about that when we get these back onto the car. Now I've really cleaned up this brake backplate to make it look good again. But before we refit the shoes, it's really important that there are some points we lubricate. There are 3 contact points each side where the brake shoes make contact with the backplate. Now, if we just fit the shoes here without doing anything with these, as and when you brake, put your foot on the brake, or when you pull the handbrake lever up and down, you'll hear a screeching, like a metal to metal sound. So we need to put some either copperslip, which is what I have, or Plastilube, which is a VW Audi product, and that will prevent that squeaking noise, which will really drive you mad and mean you've got to take the whole damn thing apart again to resolve. Now you don't want to go too mad with this because you don't want it to end up on your actual brake linings, but it's important that it's on here. And that's all done. I also like to put a bit of copperslip here as well, with the brake shoes contacts there at the bottom. It's just another thing that can prevent noise. Just a point to mention, it's always worth checking that these springs, pins and cups are in good condition. If these are in any way mangled, then definitely change them, because these hold the brake shoes in place, and if these fail, the brake shoes just jam up in there and move about, which is never good. So always just check that these aren't mangled. You can buy these in kits. Once again, move the spring and refit the connection to the handbrake cable. Push the pistons in, and we can get one of the brake shoes into place, and it's just push and twist 90 degrees. The shoe's not in its final resting place, but it's just in there for the moment. Next we refit the other shoe and we get the adjuster back together. It's a little bit fiddly, this bit, but not entirely impossible. We can now refit this top spring. If you pull these brake shoes out and forwards, you reduce the distance between these two holes for this spring, and this makes it easier to fit, and then you can lever these back into place afterwards. And the shoes are back in place. So before we think about putting the drum back on, let's just take a final look at this. So everything is refitted there. The adjuster, you can see, has been wound pretty much all the way in. You can see the thread in there. The springs are all in position. The shoe retaining pins, cups and springs are all in good condition and fitted correctly. The handbrake cable is correctly fitted to the lever. Lower spring is in position. Shoes are seated correctly at the bottom. Everything is pretty much ready for the new brake drum. So here is the new brake drum. They do come with a protective coating of oil to protect them in transit and prevent them from having corrosion, so just need to clean it up with some brake cleaner inside here to make sure that this oil doesn't remain in place where it would contaminate the brake shoes, which should be a waste considering that they're new. The drum is cleaned and degreased. I really like the fact that these Febi Bilstein brake drums come with some paint treatment on them, because they can get scruffy really quickly if they don't have this and go rusty in no time, so it's really good that they've got that on there. Just clean up this wheel hub and put a bit of fresh copper slip around it, and the drum can be refitted. So I've repeated the same process for the other side, for the offside. Everything's back together. No point in filming the same job again on the other side. It is the same thing. You don't need to see it twice. But this is the finished article. So just to confirm that everything is in place. Lower springs, shoe securing, cup, springs and pins that side, adjuster mechanism, and up upper spring is all in place. Wheel cylinder done, and the view from the back. This drum has been degreased with brake cleaner and is just being refitted. Let's retighten this T30, and we're now ready for brake bleeding. So time to bleed the brakes. I've got this brake bleeder hooked up to the reservoir, powered by a spare wheel. So I loosen each bleed nipple in turn, and I like to drain a good ½ litre if possible through each bleed nipple. It's important to keep an eye on the reservoir, as you don't want that to run dry and introduce air to the system. And around to the offside rear, and open up the front brake bleed nipple, near side front, and bleed that. And while that's all happening, I can just have a look at these brakes. There's a very small wear limit on these cars, so nearly every time you change the pads you end up needing to change the discs if you adhere to that wear limit. These pads look like they've got some life left at the moment, but I will change the discs when they need doing. And finally, we bleed fluid through the offside front. We finish on the wheel that's closest to the master cylinder, which is on this side of the front. And again, just a good opportunity to have a look at this brake. Obviously you do them in axle pairs anyway, so I already said I'll be changing the discs when I do the pads, but you can see here that there is sufficient life left at the moment. So here we are, job done. Nice new brake drums through the wheels. That's how it would have looked when it was new. Now it's time to take this car for a road test. I'm letting the auto adjusters do their own thing, as in adjust themselves, so I do expect quite a lot of pedal travel initially, so I will pump the pedal a whole bunch of times, like 50 times, and operate the handbrake over and over, and the adjusters will do their work and slowly decrease the distance between the linings and the drums. Obviously it's all new in there, so it shouldn't need to adjust too far. That's just the way I do it. You can set them up by adjusting them manually, but that can be a dangerous strategy, because if you slightly over tighten, you end up with a situation where the brakes, when they expand, end up binding, and the whole lot gets red hot and you just destroy everything you've fitted. So I'm always wary about doing that. Over the years I've seen so many cars come back from service with red hot brakes at the back, where an overzealous technician has over adjusted the rear brakes. So I'm always over cautious, probably maybe too cautious, but I don't like the idea of ruining all those components that I've just fitted. So off for a road test. Well, I'm just back from road test, and there was a lot of brake travel when I first got in it, as I expected, and when I pulled the handbrake up it was pointing at the moon. But after numerous brake applications and pulling the handbrake up and down, the handbrake is now back to 5 clicks and the brake pedal travel is back to normal, so those little self-adjusters have worked beautifully, and the brakes are lovely, very smooth and very sharp now with the new brake fluid. All in all, a good result. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the video. It's great to have all new brakes on the back of this Smart, and nice fresh brake fluid that's all been bled through. It'll take a little while for those brakes to bed in, and full braking efficiency will return very soon. The next video is going to be on the Jeep. For quite a while now I've been mentioning the fuel tank, which has finally arrived, and I'll be fitting that in the next video, which will be coming soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.